bid on abandoned storage lots. Last week, I found something horrifying. Bidding on abandoned storage lots is a lot more glamorous on television than it is in the flesh. On reality TV, the auctions are filled with colorful characters that you'd love to grab a beer with, and every other rusty door holds priceless collections of Civil War artifacts ready for sale. In the flesh and bone world, the storage hunters aren't quirky savants who can smell out a hidden boon a mile away. They're carry-on birds, searching for a cost to benefit high. The real world holds significantly less treasures as well. When that mysterious door slides up, you're more likely to find an old wedding dress and stacks of poorly written love letters than something that's going to pay for your kid's college. Storage lot auctions aren't glamorous places, but they still manage to scratch that itch in the back of my brain. I used to gamble. I used to be good enough to do it professionally. Yet, as these stories go, Lady Luck found some other sob and my career was short-lived. When the bills came tumbling down, I promised my wife, under threat of divorce, that I would never touch cards again. That promise I have kept. When she found out I was betting on a different kind of sport, she was furious. Her finding out, however, coincided with me bringing back home a dusty lawnmower that worked without a hitch. That tempered her anger somewhat. When I returned a month later with a vintage Lego collection that fetched a nice enough price to warrant a vacation, her displeasure diluted into compromise. We made rules. I had a $300 budget for my hobby, and at the end of each month I would have to walk her through what I found and how much it fetched. It felt emasculating to run everything by my wife. She knows better than anyone that I need rules to not slide off to a dark place. For months, our rules have kept me from selling out our future again. For months, I have obeyed and kept on the straight and narrow and stifled my inner demons to keep my marriage afloat. Yet, old habits die hard. At my latest auction, I let myself get drunk off of the high of the chase. I broke our rules and have grown to deeply regret it. The start of the evening was far from interesting. In fact, it might have possibly been the most unimpressive showing I have seen at all my auctions. From the 10 or so lots that were shown, each had the makings of sentimental heaps rather than collector's items. I bid once or twice, but I never pressed my claim. My gut kept telling me that there might be something more worthwhile waiting for me deeper into the storage facility. In a way, in a very misguided way, my instincts were correct. The additional locks caught my attention, along with the usual storage chain. There were 2 other heaps of metal attached to the door of the storage lot. The auctioneer informed us that the facility didn't have the keys to the other 2 locks, but that a bolt cutter would be provided free of charge to the highest bidder. The 2 extra locks piqued my interest, yet it was the man in the drab suit that cemented my need to own whatever was hidden in the storage lot. Heavy, rushed footsteps preceded him. The sound was so distinct in the tight concrete halls that the bidding was paused until the latecomer arrived. He must have been in his late 60s, or perhaps he simply treated his body very poorly. Both his gray pants and plaid jacket were a couple sizes too big for him, and he spoke in a thick Eastern European accent. It was obvious that the man wasn't from around here. It was also obvious he was not interested in bidding. As if the rest of the storage hunters were invisible, the man approached the auctioneer and spoke to him in raspy, quiet words. The auctioneer was wholly uninterested in whatever the old man had to say, but his temper calmed when the old man produced 2 keys that fit the locks. The storage space was his, he announced in broken English. There would be no auction. The auctioneer's face quickly hardened. The old man did, in fact, have the keys to the 2 additional locks, yet the facility locks were still left without a key. Without any proof of ownership, the auction would continue as planned. The strange man seemed to struggle with this idea. He kept repeating how the storage unit belonged to his colleague and how he was the next in line to own it. It wasn't until the bidding started that he gave up on arguing. The initial bid was $50. The crowd was happy to raise. In 10s and 20s, the price accumulated, and the old man watched in despair. When the price had climbed up to $150, with utter discomfort, the man in the drab suit yelled $300. This, momentarily, quieted down the bidding. The additional locks had piqued my interest. The presence of the strange foreigner raised it further. It wasn't until I heard the desperation in his voice that accompanied the $300 bid that I truly had skin in the game, though. Trying not to think about my wife's face, I offered up $350. The old man's face grew twice as weary. Instead of offering up another bid, he started to argue with the auctioneer in panicked whispers. The auctioneer was deaf to his pleas. All he wanted to hear was a $400 bid. Eventually, with sweat pooling on his brow, the old man relented. He bid $400. I immediately bid $450. The old man didn't bother negotiating with the auctioneer anymore. Now, he was speaking directly to me. He insisted that he was the rightful owner of the storage space. It belonged to a research partner of his from many years ago. That's why he had the keys to the 2 additional locks. He demanded that I stop bidding and leave him to take what is rightfully his. The old man smelled overwhelmingly of sweat and cheap cologne. His breath was of coffee and cigarettes and the slightest hint of sickness. It wasn't pleasant to hear him beg, but I was far too interested in what was hiding behind those metal doors. In broken English, the man tried to change my mind. He couldn't. When that fact dawned upon him, he produced a bushel of crumpled bills out of his pocket. He counted them with shaking, spotted hands. He offered $640 for the unit. When our eyes met, I could sense the slightest bit of relief in his face. He thought he had outbid me. He thought the storage unit was his already. He thought wrong. I offered up $650. The old man had nothing else to bid. In a satisfying collection of seconds that sent a truckload of dopamine crashing through my skull, I became the new owner of the storage unit. The old man pleaded with me. With wet eyes and strained words, he begged me to take his money and leave the mystery of the storage unit be. His begging well surpassed the point of pity. It did not feel good to meet his eyes. I felt bad for the old man, yet I am a slave to the gods of chance. I would not ignore their boon. The old man was relentless in his pleas. When the manager of the storage facility suggested he might call the police, however, the old man quickly retreated. With the strange foreigner out of sight, he faded from my mind. I was too distracted with the contents of the storage space to spare him any more thought. I paid for the lot and signed all the necessary paperwork with the auctioneer and then made my way through the labyrinthian maze of cement and metal to claim my prize. The lock had been left untouched for years and the key had trouble fitting through the rust. Yet when it did, when that dirty door came up with a metallic groan, I knew I had struck gold. It was a big storage space, big enough to house a car with plenty of room to spare. The place was filled to the brim. Most of its contents were hidden beneath slabs of dirty cloth, but the storage unit was filled with vintage Pokemon merch. Every inch of the cement walls was covered in Pokemon posters and calendars. Every mysterious object draped in cloth was also covered in countless collections of Pokemon toys and keychains and plushies. The toys were worn and out of their boxes, but I could definitely get at least $200 for them alone. With the rest of the storage space draped in mystery, my gambler's heart fluttered at the prospect of inheriting a collector's collection. My expectations were high, yet when I ripped away one of the cloth drapes, I turned lightheaded. I was looking at a centrifuge, a high-tech, expensive-looking centrifuge straight out of a rich people hospital. A quick Google nearly dropped me to the ground. The thing was worth at least $1,000. My investment had definitely paid off. There was nothing that I wanted to do more than to rip down all the coverings and revel in my good fortune all at once, yet the rush from the centrifuge was strong enough. I elected to take the lab tech home and pace out my dopamine rush from my earnings over the next couple of days. Though I regret to admit it, a plan hatched in my head. I was going to take the centrifuge back home and sing praises of my good luck to my wife. She would surely be happy about my return on investment, but there was no need for her to know about the rest of the storage unit. The fates had shown me good fortune. It was time for me to move past the silly financial limit my wife put on my hobby. The money from the rest of the storage unit would be my seed fund for future bidding. Or so I thought. When I walked out into the chill night air, I found the parking lot to be completely empty. My wife was visiting her sister for the weekend, so there was no rush for me to get home, but it was getting late. I figured I would grab the dolly from my truck, get the centrifuge loaded up, and then surprise her with it Sunday afternoon. Had I simply loaded up the centrifuge, locked up the storage unit, and went back home, things would have turned out different, and I would have been richer for it. By the time I was back in the storage unit, however, the rush of winning had passed. I wanted another peek at the mysterious objects I had paid for. I promised myself I would only reveal one more object to myself, yet I do not have a good history of keeping promises. Under the first cloth covering, I found a chest-high microscope. Beneath the second, an expensive piece of lab equipment I could not identify. Beneath the third, I found a sort of incubator that had enough circuitry in it to suggest at least another $1,000. Had I turned back home then, had I even a shred of self-control, I would have gone home a wealthy man. Yet, I am a slave to the rush, and the 3 previous finds had whet my appetite. Expecting another burst of dopamine, I ripped off the 4th cloth covering. I let out a shriek. As the dirty fabric gathered around my feet, all I could do was stare. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but somewhere deep inside of my chest, I knew I was witness to something patently against the laws of nature. The creature was suspended in a liquid-filled vat. It had 6 legs, a strange vine-like growth stemming from its back, and vaguely, very vaguely, resembled a cat. The thing was, presumably, dead, yet it was no less terrifying. Suddenly, the thought of being alone at the storage facility started to bother me. In an effort to distract myself with more expensive laboratory equipment, I tore down another cloth covering. Instead of priceless scientific instruments, I found a similar vat. I steadied myself enough to not scream, but I was no less terrified. The creature that floated in this one resembled a bear, yet it was no bigger than a raccoon. Even in its small size, the floating beast terrified me. Its open maw was filled with a menagerie of misshapen, sharp teeth which looked like they could bite through steel. There was a thick web of skin stemming from the creature's paws, suggesting it once took flight. The beast was undoubtedly not the work of nature. The contents of the storage lot brought forth suggestions of dark science and terrible experiments. The dolly with the centrifuge was right next to me. I could have retreated back home, but instead, in terror, I stripped all the hidden objects of their obscurity. I found a couple more pieces of expensive-looking equipment. They gave me no joy, even when I found a second, larger centrifuge. I simply went on to uncover the rest of the storage space. I found terrible creatures which will haunt my dreams until the end of time. A sort of crab creature with human eyes upon its shell, a snake with pairs of wings which covered its spine, a glob of gray flesh covered in bug-like eyes and twigs and flowers. There were about a dozen of the vats, and each inspired more discomfort than the last. Above each of the vats sat a sort of designation: GA 007, GB 028, FA 004. The final covering lay on top of a vat, housing a genetic amalgamation I couldn't even begin to describe. Atop of the vat sat a coffee-stained Pokemon notebook. The hybrid encyclopedia, its title read in neat handwriting. It is only once I opened the notebook that I understood the markings that adorned the vats. They were names. Every page was dedicated to a different creature, with rough sketches and neatly ordered notes. The notebook described many more creatures than were present in the storage unit. There were at least 100 pages. I tried to read the entries for the experiments that were present within the vats, but my heart was racing far too much to make sense of the tiny letters on the page. Just as I calmed just as I centered myself enough to be able to make sense of the mystery I was entangled in, I felt a sharp prick in my neck. "Sorry," said the old man in the ill-fitting suit. "I did try to warning you." Naturally, I was startled when I first saw him. I did, however, feel a semblance of relief about not being the only one in the presence of those strange creatures. The old man was considerably smaller than me and seemed harmless enough. I thought myself lucky to be in the presence of a man who knew more about these hybrids. That mirage of luck dissipated the moment I looked at the old man's hand. There was a syringe in it. Steadily, a tingling numbness spread from my neck. Before I could even register I'd been poisoned, I was crashing to the floor. With a great grunt of effort, the old man caught me and lowered me to the cold ground. Even though he had just stuck a syringe in my neck, his eyes were apologetic to the point of wetness. A storage unit. It belonged to crazy man Professor Willow. He is obsessed. "I'm sorry," the old man said, squatting down next to me. "I'm sorry, but this storage is important. Willow must be ended. His early research is important. I am sorry." By then, the numbness had spread all throughout my body, yet my neck continued to throb with renewed tingly beats. With each pulse, my vision grew foggy, and the world beyond echoed with distance. I could register the old man depositing the syringe in his ill-fitting jacket and then fishing around for something else. Before his hand emerged again, he was nothing but a vague blur. "It is poison, but it does not kill. I'm sorry. I'm not thief. I am man, trying to helping." Briefly, before my consciousness fully faded away, I sensed something being pressed into my palm. Then, with my thoughts stumbling into nothingness, I passed out. I woke to a phone call from my wife. She had just come home from her sister's and I was nowhere to be found. From the sound of my raspy voice and my inability to articulate my words, she presumed I'd been on a weekend bender. Without giving me a chance to explain myself, she hung up. I was stretched out on the cold floor of the storage lot. My cheeks were covered in drool and I was next to what I presumed to be a pool of vomit. The fact that I was alive and able to feel my limbs provided a flicker of relief, but the flame was quickly snuffed out. The storage lot was empty. There were still vintage Pokemon posters and calendars over the walls, and none of the toys seemed to have been moved. Yet all the expensive equipment I had celebrated so heartily was gone. The terrible monstrosities encased in vats were gone as well, but I did not mourn those. On the mornings when you wake up far from your bed covered in drool, it's usually the money that you mourn. I decided I would not tell my wife how I had spent my weekend. When I came home, we argued and I let her believe that I had simply spent the weekend boozing. I did, however, insist that I didn't play any cards or gamble in any other fashion. She, after some convincing, believed me. I didn't want to tell my wife about the maddening hybrids. Partially, I did this because she wouldn't believe me. By the time I was back home, I was already working on trying to convince myself that it was all a fabulation anyway. The other reason why I didn't tell my wife, however, was that I didn't want to get into trouble. I did break our budget rule during the auction, and I knew that was a bigger sin than a weekend of boozing. It's not like she would ever find out anyway. The things which the old man told me as I succumbed to whatever paralytic poison he injected me with, I do not understand, and I do not care to explore. In one thing, however, he was honest. The old man was not a thief. When I woke on the floor of the storage lot, I found a crumpled stack of bills in my hand. $640 to be exact. With the toys and posters, I could definitely cover more than the $10 I invested. Though I have witnessed unspeakable crimes against nature, and though I am still recovering from the unknown poison, my finances were still in the black. Though I have witnessed unspeakable crimes against nature, and though I am still recovering from the unknown poison, my finances were still in the black. Thank you for listening and delving into the dark with me. I would be so grateful if you please click the thumbs up, subscribe, and leave me a comment. The more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube will push my content to others, and thus our twisted little community will grow. All stories read on this channel will be available on Spotify, iTunes, iHeartRadio, and many other podcast apps. Links are in the description. Thank you again for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you.